Thank you very much. I am truly honored to be with you today. I want to begin by thanking my hosts and everyone at JST who made it possible for me to come to this conference. This is my first visit to Tokyo, and I have fallen in love with your city. It is a wonderful place, and you all have been very gracious and helpful, and I appreciate that very much. Because I know that I'm being translated simultaneously, I'm going to try not to speak too quickly. This will be a challenge for me, but I will do my best. We are here today because we share an interest in the present state and the future of scholarly communication, which is an ecosystem that we care about, partly because it's where we all work and make our living, and partly because we know it has a real impact in the real world. When scientific and scholarly work is done and the results are published and disseminated, that work affects government policy, academic discourse, and people's everyday lives. So it really matters. And that means that the system of scholarly communication matters. We need to understand how it works, and we need to understand when it has problems. Scholarly communication does have problems, of course, because it's a human system, and all human systems have problems. The problems arise partly from the fact that scholarly communication is a highly complex ecosystem. We'll discuss some of those complexities today. Problems also arise from the fact that members of this ecosystem are often in conflict with each other because they often disagree about how the system should work. And problems arise from the fact that the system has undergone dramatic change in recent years and will certainly undergo further dramatic change in the near future. So what I'd like to do today is talk a little bit about all of these issues. First of all, why do I call scholarly communication an ecosystem? As a matter of fact, I believe that this is the most important thing to understand about scholarly communication. The fact that it is a large, complex, and international ecosystem that includes many different parts, functions, and participants, all of which interact with and have an impact on each other. Furthermore, it also includes many different scholarly and scientific cultures. And those cultures themselves may be very different from one country or global region to another. For example, a sociologist is working in a different academic culture from a biologist, but a biologist in Zimbabwe is working in a different culture than a biologist in China or in Germany. An editor is doing different work from a peer reviewer, but their work is interdependent. A funding agency may not be a publisher, but it makes decisions that have significant impacts on publishers as well as on authors, on research institutions, and on readers. Scholars and scientists are authors, but they are also readers. They consume scholarly and scientific content as well as produce it. And they may also be faculty members at research institutions or employees of scientific companies. The scholarly communication system is vast, diverse, and complex. It is also deeply interconnected. And this means that the actions that one person or organization takes will always affect others, sometimes in desired and intended ways, and sometimes in undesired and unintended ways. This is true of actions undertaken in the normal course of work, and it's especially true of actions undertaken for the purpose of changing the system itself. What all of this means is that we need to be both careful and humble when seeking to change the system. Please note that I'm not saying we shouldn't try to change the system. I'm only saying that we need to be humble and careful about doing so. And I'd like to say something parenthetically here. I've been working in scholarly communication for about 27 years. And one of the things I've noticed is that the less you understand about a system, the easier and cheaper changing that system will seem to you. And the less likely you are to anticipate all the consequences of changing that system. This definitely applies in the realm of scholarly publishing, where many people who know little or nothing about it are currently working to change it in revolutionary ways. I'm afraid that this is a recipe for disaster, not changing the system itself, but changing it without sufficient knowledge and with a predetermined outcome in mind. Anyway, back to complexity. The people and organizations in the scholarly communication ecosystem include the scientists and scholars who conduct research, generate data, and write about it for publication, government policymakers who make rules that govern how funding is distributed and what must happen with the research results, the universities, research centers, and corporations that hire scientists and scholars and provide facilities and salaries for them, the funding agencies that pay the costs of specific research projects, publishers who filter and review and edit and make research reports available to the public and who curate the permanent archive of versions of record, and libraries who act as brokers of access to published content, who help researchers find the publications they need, and often serve in various publishing and curation functions themselves. There are other members of the ecosystem too, of course: students, teaching faculty, interested members of the general public, third-party aggregators of research content, university administrators, especially research administrators, and others. Over the past 100 years, and especially in the last 2 decades, there's been a huge increase in the amount and the diversity of research being conducted and written about across the world. I can't stress enough how much this explosion in the amount and the diversity of research being conducted has impacted and changed the scholarly communication landscape. Here's one chart that illustrates some of this explosive growth, and I realize it may be difficult for everyone to read this chart, so I'll quickly explain. The yellow line shows that between 1997 and 2017, so over a 20-year period, research output as measured by articles, reviews, and conference papers from the European Union roughly doubled. The blue line shows that during that same period, research output in the United States increased by about 65%. The red line shows China's research output increasing by over 1,600%. These data points tell a couple of different stories. One is the tremendous increase in global research output over the last 20 years. Another is the way in which China is quickly gaining on Europe and the US. We'll talk a little more about this in a few minutes. Right now, the point is that this tremendous growth in research has all kinds of impacts on the scholarly communication ecosystem. For one thing, it has led to huge growth in the number of journals being published and in the number of disciplinary specialties in which people publish. As more and more research is done, 2 things happen. First, more research leads to more information, which leads to more questions and more avenues of research. This leads to more disciplinary specialties and a need for new journals in which to publish findings for those new specialties. Second, More research leads to academic researchers needing to specialize more and more in order to compete with their colleagues. If someone else has already discovered penicillin, then you need to discover something else. Academic competition is a very real and very powerful engine of scientific discovery and also of journal proliferation. These dynamics also create much more work for editors and peer reviewers and have made it harder and harder for scholars and scientists to get published in top journals, which of course they all want to do so that they can keep their jobs. At the same time that research output has been exploding, we've seen a wholesale transition in scholarly and scientific publishing from the print realm into the online realm, at least in the developed world. The scholarly communication ecosystem has always been complex, but with the advent of the internet, which moved scholarly publication, especially journal publication, and especially in the sciences, almost entirely online, it has become much more so. It's important not to underestimate how significant this shift has been. It has meant the emancipation of information. For centuries, information was locked in physical objects. It can now be copied and distributed at effectively zero cost, though the costs of creating, curating, and maintaining information are as high as they ever were, and in some cases higher. For example, during the print era, a journal publisher was not expected to maintain a publicly accessible archive of the content it published. Libraries did that. Now, libraries typically pay for access, and publishers maintain the content archive indefinitely, while also licensing access to third-party providers. That's just one example of a major change in the ecosystem that has been brought about by the internet revolution. The existence of institutional repositories further complicates this picture, of course. But the transition from print to online is itself one of the factors that has led to the explosion in research output. The more easily and broadly scholarship is disseminated, the more research can flourish. So this is a phenomenon that feeds on itself. It's also true that many governments greatly increased their spending on scientific research during the past few decades, which has also fueled the increase in scientific output. However, I mentioned a moment ago that this transition has been especially comprehensive in the developed world. It's important to remember that in many less developed countries and regions, the transition to an online information environment has been much less complete. In a country with spotty internet access or an unreliable electrical supply, printed books and journals remain a very important source of scholarly information. The shift from print to online publishing has also made possible the emergence of an entirely new model of access to science and scholarship, one in which the costs of publishing are not paid by readers, but are instead paid by other members of the ecosystem, thus making the content freely accessible to readers. Sometimes those costs are paid by authors, sometimes by institutions, sometimes the costs are underwritten by funding agencies, sometimes they're paid by libraries under new kinds of purchasing agreements that result in the library paying publication fees on behalf of authors rather than access fees on behalf of readers. Publishing models that make content freely available to readers are what we call open access models, and they have arisen over the past 20 years. It's probably obvious to all of us, but I'll say it anyway, that open access is only possible in an online environment. You can't make printed documents freely available to all. The distribution costs are simply too high, and the logistical challenges are too great. But because the internet makes delivery effectively instantaneous, and lowers the marginal cost of a copy virtually to nothing, open access is possible in the digital networked environment. Here you can see on this chart the growing proportion of open access publishing over the past 18 years, along with a projection of how that proportion is expected to continue to grow through 2025. The different colors in this chart represent different kinds of open access publishing. The gray area represents publishing on a paid access basis. Now, it's important to bear in mind that the projections in the last part of the chart were made by open access advocates, so they may be a bit optimistic. But even if open access were to stay stable over the next decade, it would still represent a significant share of scholarly and scientific publishing and an area that we should watch and understand. Now, obviously, open access has created new problems as well as solving old ones. Like any access model, open access comes with costs and unintended consequences, as well as benefits and intended consequences. So, for example, if the costs of publishing are borne by authors instead of libraries, authors who don't have access to those funds are shut out. If the costs of publishing are borne by research funders, then the research funders have less money to spend on research. If the costs of publishing are borne by a scientific society, then the society has less money with which to provide services to its members, and so forth. There is another very important unintended consequence of open access, and I think it's important to take a few moments to discuss it here. That is the consequence of predatory publishing. Most of you are familiar with this phenomenon, I'm sure, but I'm going to explain it for the benefit of anyone who may not be very familiar with it. One of the most common funding models for open access, and by some measures the most common funding model, is the article processing charge, or APC. Under this model, articles are submitted and evaluated in the traditional way, and if the article is accepted for publication, the author is charged a fee to cover the publication costs. This allows the publisher to make the article freely available to the public without losing revenue. The APC model has much to recommend it. The biggest benefit it offers, obviously, is that everyone in the world is given access to content published in this way, rather than only the journal's subscribers or people affiliated with subscribing institutions. The APC model also has a very serious problem, however, and that problem is the conflict of interest that it creates. Under this model, the journal's interest in excluding bad science comes into conflict with its interest in maintaining its revenue stream. Obviously, the more articles the journal rejects, the less money comes in. Legitimate publishers manage this conflict honestly and effectively, and don't let their financial interest override their interest in preserving the integrity of the scholarly record. However, not all publishers are legitimate. The rise of this funding model has led to the emergence of what we call predatory or deceptive publishers who have no interest in preserving the integrity of the scholarly record, but care only about making as much money as possible. These publishers solicit manuscripts from authors, often aggressively, and often without telling authors up front that they will be charged an APC. These journals often claim, falsely, to be peer-reviewed. They will claim affiliation with organizations that don't exist. They will list people on their editorial boards who have never agreed to be on them, and so forth. Because these journals exist purely to attract APCs, they will literally publish anything. There have been numerous sting operations that have exposed this practice. I'm actually in the middle of performing one such operation myself. I'm writing a blog post on the topic of predatory publishing, And in order to illustrate the problem, I responded to an email solicitation from a predatory journal in the field of heart surgery. To be clear, this is a field in which I have no expertise. In response to that solicitation, I put together an article by taking randomly selected paragraphs from other cardiovascular surgery journals. I made up a nonsensical title for the author, and I submitted it to the journal under a fake name. Just a week ago, I learned that it has been accepted for publication and that I can expect to see a galley proof shortly. Yesterday, I received an email requesting an APC payment in the amount of $1,100. Right now, the best estimate is that at least 12,000 predatory journals are in operation around the world. All of us in this room understand why this kind of publishing is a problem. But dealing with the problem is complicated for a number of reasons, one of which is that whenever we try to talk about it, members of the open access movement become angry and defensive. They see this discussion as an attack on open access rather than what it is, an attempt to preserve the integrity of the scientific record against those who want to abuse one particular open access funding model for personal gain. But this brings us to another very large problem we are dealing with in scholarly communication. The fact that open access has quickly turned into a moral crusade, a movement built on the belief that since open access is structurally possible in the internet environment, and since there are very clear benefits to making scholarly information freely available to all, open access is therefore morally required and must be universal and mandatory. This makes the analytical discussion of the costs and benefits of open access very difficult, because to suggest that open access has problems and costs as well as benefits is to risk being attacked as an enemy of open access. But rational analysis of open access is especially important because open access represents a growing segment of the scholarly publishing scene, and because it really does pose costs and downsides as well as very real benefits and upsides. I would suggest that the biggest problem with open access is not open access itself. Open access is a good model. And like all publishing models, it offers a mix of benefits and costs. The problem is with the open access movement, which resists and punishes any attempt to discuss open access models in an analytical and rational way. To many who are involved with promoting open access, it is simply morally unacceptable to charge for access to scholarly content, so there's no point in arguing about whether doing so is worth the cost. Obviously, this gets in the way of rational policy formation. I would suggest, when you can't discuss the pros and cons of a specific solution or set of solutions in a rational and analytical way, you will inevitably end up with conflict, at least in part because this undermines your ability to anticipate problems and prepare to deal with them. However, an unwillingness to discuss access models in an analytical way is only part of what leads to conflict in scholarly communication. More fundamentally, conflict in scholarly communication arises first when we have to make difficult decisions about limited resources, and second, when people want mutually exclusive things. Obviously, both of these are challenges that we deal with in the scholarly communication ecosystem. We have a limited number of dollars, which means that every dollar we spend on one thing, like research, is a dollar that can't be spent on something else, like the costs of publishing. This is especially concerning when we think about research funders whose money is being increasingly redirected away from the support of research and towards the support of open access publishing. Both the underwriting of research and the free public distribution of research outputs provide benefits to society. But which of them provides the most benefit? This is a difficult question, and it's one that we can't effectively address if we can't talk about the costs and benefits of each activity. Our limited resources also contribute to another major problem in scholarly communication, the fact that more and more journals are published every year, and the prices charged for them go up at unsustainable rates relative to library budgets. This reality is a big part of what gave rise to the open access movement, and it is a very serious problem. We also have individuals and groups within the ecosystem who fundamentally disagree with each other or who want things that are mutually exclusive. Let's look at some examples of those conflicts. Measuring academic prestige is a major source of disagreement in the system. Many people, especially in libraries, feel that traditional structures of promotion and tenure are flawed because they place too much emphasis on publishing in high prestige journals that libraries can't afford. Many faculty members actually agree. Unfortunately, however, there is no agreement within academia as to what should replace these traditional structures. There isn't even agreement about how deeply flawed they are. Certainly, many faculty members think that their system of promotion and tenure works pretty well. Sometimes when I mention that, people say, well, sure, the people who have gotten tenure think the system works fine. But in my experience, it's most of the faculty, junior and senior faculty, who generally believe that the system of promotion and tenure is functioning the way it should. Not everyone, but most. It's also worth noting that the whole question of prestige is itself becoming more controversial. What does it really mean to produce prestigious research? In practice, this means publishing one's research in highly ranked journals and getting it widely cited. But this begs a question. What makes one journal more highly ranked than another? Should rankings matter as much as they do? Should they be formulated the way they are? And how do you distinguish between positive citations and negative ones? These are complicated questions, obviously, and we don't have time to fully address them here, but I would say this. To the degree that a journal's ranking accurately reflects the quality of the research it publishes, then yes, rankings do matter. It matters whether a journal has a history of publishing very good research or mediocre research or nonsense. But of course, whether a journal's ranking accurately reflects the quality of the scholarship it publishes is a separate question. The same is true for measures of research impact. Many people agree that the journal impact factor is a deeply flawed measure, but nothing has yet emerged to replace it. There are rival impact factor models that have emerged and taken hold in the scholarly communication system, but none of them has yet displaced the journal impact factor. One of the compounding factors in this controversy is the tendency of academics to use the impact factor as a quality measurement when it is not designed for that purpose and was never intended to be used that way. We also struggle to find the right balance between individual rights and the individual's obligation to the greater good. Should authors have the right to decide for themselves whether to make their work open access, or should they be required to do so because open access is so clearly in the public interest? But more fundamentally, we struggle to achieve consensus on what actually constitutes the public interest. Not everyone believes that open access is, in fact, always the model that best serves the public interest. Then there's what I call the struggle between monism and pluralism, or between a system that offers only a single model and one that offers a diversity of models. The biggest example of this struggle is, again, in the world of open access. Some want a system, a scholarly communication ecosystem, that includes only open access to scholarship and no paid access. Others want a system that offers a mix of access models. Unfortunately, you can't have both. Either we will have nothing but OA, or we will have a mix of OA and non-OA. This disagreement over which of these scenarios is the most desirable is one of the biggest sources of conflict in scholarly communication right now. And the conflict is made deeper by the fact that some of those who want a 100% open access ecosystem don't like to acknowledge that that's what they're pursuing. So as we look to the future and try to plan for it, there are a few things that I think we can be certain about. One of them is that China's research growth will continue. If its economy continues to grow, it will continue to undertake and publish more research every year. And even if its economy stagnates, I think it's very likely that its government will make sacrifices elsewhere in the economy in order to continue its research growth. It seems clear to me both that the Chinese government wants to achieve global dominance and that it understands that its path to global dominance will be made possible in large part by its becoming a leader in scientific output, and I believe it is committed to that path. But China is not the only global region in which we should expect to see significant future growth. The developing economies of the global south are also making increasing contributions to scientific research, and we would be wise to watch closely what happens in those regions over the next 5 to 10 years. India has made great strides recently, and I think we should be watching very carefully developments in Brazil and Saudi Arabia as well. I'm also confident that the resurgence of nationalism in regional politics will have a significant impact on future developments in scholarly communication. I've already mentioned that in the context of China, but we're seeing hints of this in the United States as well. And Brexit will inevitably have an impact on scholarly communication in Great Britain and across Europe. To the degree that nationalism leads to authoritarian governance, we will see more and more restrictions on access to information, such as we already see in places like Iran, China, North Korea, Ethiopia, and Cuba. In the US, I think President Trump would probably restrict internet access if he could, but so far he can't. As I mentioned previously, there's every reason to believe that open access will continue to grow. It's increasingly being embraced by commercial publishers who have figured out that open access models can offer them new revenue streams and who don't want to be branded as anti-open access. Scientists and authors themselves remain largely uninterested in open access, not opposed to it, but for the most part, not very interested. But governments and funding agencies are increasingly moving to take the choice away from authors, and more publishers are creating open access and hybrid journals in order to make themselves compliant with government and funder mandates. So there is no question that open access will continue to grow. Will it become universal? That's possible, but I very much doubt it. The only way open access can become universal is if it is either accepted universally on a voluntary basis by all scholars and scientists, or if the choice is taken away from them and it becomes universally required. I don't think either scenario is likely, and if I'm correct, then we can assume that there will be ongoing conflict in the scholarly communication ecosystem between those who want universal mandatory open access and those who don't. Something else we can expect is disruption in the system as the result of the development of artificial intelligence. This is a field about which I know very little, so I can't be more specific than that. I only know enough to know that artificial intelligence has the potential to transform editorial processes, peer review, impact measurements, and the conduct of research itself. and therefore it's something we should watch carefully as a potential game changer for science and scholarship generally. My final point. It's all well and good to talk about what's happening now and what seems likely to happen in the future, but I would imagine that what you are most urgently wondering is, what should I do to prepare? Obviously, the specific answer to that question for each of you will depend on many different factors, including what kind of publishing you do, who your authors and readers are, and what your sources of funding are. However, there's one answer that I believe applies universally. Pay attention to what's happening in the world of scholarly communication and make sure your voices are heard. Practices and policies are changing all around you. You are, for the most part, not being consulted about them. And if you decide not to pay attention and not to get involved in the conversations that are leading to these changes, you will guarantee that your interests and your needs and the interests and needs of those you serve will not be a factor in those decisions. Thank you very much for your time and attention today. I'm very grateful again for the opportunity to be here. We have a few minutes for questions and comments, but I also wanted to say that you should please not hesitate to contact me by email if later on you would like to discuss these issues further with me. Thank you very much.
アンダーソン様、ありがとうございました。それではこれより質疑応答に移ります。挙手をされた方へマイクをお持ちいたしますので、よろしければ所属とお名前を頂戴いただければ幸いです。なお、質問は通訳を通しますので、日本語でご質問いただいて差し支えありません。それではご質問のある方いらっしゃいましたら挙手をお願いいたします。はい、ではお願いいたします。
Please pose your question in Japanese, Mark.
Hello, Rick. My name is Mark Robertson. I represent Chorus at this meeting. Your graph earlier, which showed the increase in scientific output, I'm not so sure about China, but presumably the growth in research funding is not as extreme. So I deduce that we're getting more papers per dollar spent on research. If that is correct, what can funders and journal editors and others in this room do to try and control the amount of papers that are being published, or should they not bother? Thank you.
Those are really good questions. One thing I do know is that the increase in research funding there has been a significant increase in research funding globally. It has been distributed very unevenly. The increase in output that we see in China reflects a tremendous increase in research funding. The increase in research output in the US, much less so, I think. As to your second question, is there anything that funders should do to try to control the production of papers? I don't think so. I don't think there is. I think it would be unwise to try to artificially limit the amount of research output simply because we can't anticipate which papers are going to be very, very important and very impactful and which ones aren't. Now, having said that, if we don't do something to limit the output of papers, what do we do about all of the downstream effects of that huge increase? And I don't know the answer to that.
はい、ありがとうございました。他にいかがでしょうか。ご質問ある方いらっしゃいましたら、貴重な機会でございますので、ぜひ挙手をお願いいたします。お願いいたします。
JST の小笠坂と申します。ご講演ありがとうございました。 研究業績評価における論文への偏重というのが今のスカラリーコミュニケーションの世界における問題の一因であるという示唆がございました。でしかしながら研究評価を論文で行うというのは何百年もかけてその研究者の価値追求の動機から自然に起こってきた価値体系であるというふうに思えるわけです。したがってそこに問題を見出してそれを変えようとするならばやはり研究者の行動に根ざす他の価値体系が生み出される必要があるだろうと思うわけです。それについて何かどういう可能性が見出せるとお考えでしょうか。
I'm not positive that I understand the question, but it seems to center around the question of value. What do we see as the value of research outputs, and if the things that we have valued in the past are things that we should no longer value now, then what should we do? What values should we put in its place? Is that more or less what you're asking? It seems to me that the things that we value about research outputs have always been more or less consistent. We value rigor, we value significance of impact. You know, discovering a cure for cancer is a more impactful discovery than discovering a new, I don't know, type of mushroom. Not that that's not important, but you know, and how rigorously, how logically, and how honestly the research was conducted. These are the things that we evaluate as peer reviewers when we review papers, and as editors when we decide whether papers will be published. I think that those are the things we have always evaluated, and I can't imagine a future in which those criteria are not still the criteria for research quality. I don't know what could replace those things. Reason, logic, and rigor are non-negotiable, I think.
大学科学支援学術協の土屋と申しますが、今の小笠さんの質問を、ちょっと言い換えるとっていうか、もう少し露骨に言うとた方がいいかなと思うんですが、今日研究者の、評価を行う場合にその論文業績を元にして行うという考え方は我々の科学者のコミュニティが何百年もかかって到達した現代においては他にないと思われている考え方だと思われるのですが、それが問題だとおっしゃるならば代案はあるんですか。
Okay, so the question is about assessing researchers, not about assessing articles. That is a really good question. If in fact what we value, researchers who are faculty at universities are typically judged on two broad categories: the quality of their teaching and the quality of their scholarship. If we continue to think it's important that faculty produce scholarship, I don't know how to evaluate that other than based on the scholarship that they produce. Now, it is possible to create an inflationary prestige economy in which we keep expecting them to generate more and more papers over time. That would be counterproductive. But judging them on the quality and the impact of their papers is very important. And expecting them to produce a reasonable amount of scholarship is also important. There is nothing wrong with saying, you, in order to stay on our faculty, you need to produce X number of articles a year and at least one monograph or whatever. And different disciplines have different expectations. I see nothing wrong with that kind of expectation. Now, how many articles should it be? How many books should it be? The correct answer to that is going to vary from discipline to discipline. The problem is, an answer that makes sense for a discipline may not make sense for the scholarly communication ecosystem overall because it could overload the system. Where that's the case, the answer is for the discipline to change its expectations. The problem is the discipline is not a single organism. The discipline is hundreds or thousands of people. And getting hundreds or thousands of people to do one thing or to agree on one thing is very difficult. And I think this is one of the big problems that we face in academia right now. How's that for a non-answer?